ایران ای مرز پرگوهر، ای خاک از سرچشمه هنر، دور از تو اندیشه بدان، باید بمانی تو جاودان.
Hello everyone and welcome to another entry in this series on the history of modern Iran. I'm once again joined by my good friend Hunger the Dye Merchant. How are you, Hunger?
I'm doing good. That was a very interesting opening. I'm happy to see it.
Yes. I thought it was about time I made a special intro for this series because it's gone on long enough, and I think we owe it to the history. And I'm very proud. I knocked that up earlier in about half an hour.
I don't know the song particularly, but from what I can tell, because I'm familiar with the region enough, this is a very 20th century piece. It's most certainly a 20th century, like, modern orchestra with, of course, Persian overtones.
Well, just to give a bit more background information, the song that was playing in the intro was known as Ay Iran or O Iran. It was a patriotic song that was written in the 1940s in response to the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran. So it was penned in 41 and it was put to music in 44. And it actually very briefly, for about a year, became the official national anthem of Iran during the transitional government from the Shah to the Islamic Republic. And as you may expect, that song is incredibly popular amongst the Iranian expatriate community outside Iran. Like, if you go on YouTube, you can find sort of choruses of Iranians sort of singing that song in like London or in like Munich or wherever. So yeah, and I think for good reason. I think it's probably one of the greatest. If you listened, I actually had a bit of a listen to all of the different anthems Iran's had, and that song is by far the best of all of them.
Oh, I can tell. And like I said, it's very 20th century modernist style. That was very popular in the Middle East at that time.
Certainly, but we can get a bit more into that song and its meaning when we get to later in the series. So today we are going to be looking at the so-called constitutional revolution in the early 20th century, and I think this event is where we're getting into the modern history of Iran proper, so to speak. I feel like all the episodes we've done thus far are some sort of like forerunner to what we're going to be talking about, because it's all been building up to this period. And there is a certain take that we see going around, especially amongst them sort of, Western midwits, that, the 79 revolution, it was all downstream of that 53 coup, bruh. If not for that 53 coup, the revolution wouldn't have happened, bruh. And I'm like, one, that is far too deterministic. There was far more that built up to that revolution than just the 53 coup. And secondly, if you're going to argue that any event in Iranian history was responsible for the 79 revolution, it was this constitutional revolution, because there was an ideological through line. Both were largely coalitions of many sections of society coming together against the monarchical state. The only difference is the 79 revolution was much more radical in its ideology and its outcome, whereas the constitutional revolution, it was aiming to, it helped turn Iran from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional monarchy, whereas the 79 revolution turned Iran from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional theocracy. So was there anything you want to add to that, Hunger?
Yeah, very, very different, but similar. I guess you could say a similar spirit. It should also be noted, like, at the time, this was not unique in just Iran. There was also the Young Turk Revolution in the Ottoman Empire, and the many kinds of protests and uprisings in the Ottoman Empire going on around basically the same time. These things were happening in parallel, which is also very interesting to see. Like, these pre-revolutionary type movements. There was not so much protest in the Ottoman case, but there was very much, certain factions of the elite wanting to very much radically change the government. What do you have to say on that?
No, I think that's very apt, because the many of the sort of thinkers in Iran, or those who wanted some form of modernization, were looking to what was going on in the Ottomans, because obviously the Ottomans had the Tanzimat period, or their constitutional era, and then that itself was subverted by the autocratic Abdul Hamid II. And what's interesting is Abdul Hamid II was even involved with supporting the mullahs in Iran, because again, Abdul Hamid was very much interested in this idea of pan-Islam, with himself as the leader of the international, Muslim Ummah as caliph, and so he was sort of sponsoring these sort of more reactionary tendencies in Iran as well.
Probably another thing I would add, once we get more into the details of this chapter, is Iran really is the parallel to France, because they just love protesting. They love protesting, and they love their revolutions, and they love, public demonstrations, and that's gonna go on for a very long time, and we're still seeing that today. That there's a very long history of street protests and revolutions that still goes on today. It's very relevant to the recent news.
Oh no, of course, but I think it's time we delve into the history proper. So I'm going to start with a reading from our favourite Persian historian that we've relied upon, Abbas Armanat, in his History of Modern Iran. So on the December 12th, 1905, following closure of the bazaar, a huge crowd gathered at Tehran's Friday Mosque to protest the mistreatment of the city's sugar merchants by the governor of the capital and demand that the mujtahids of the city come out in their defence. The crowd listened to Jamal al-Din Isfahani, a middle-ranking popular preacher and crypto Babi, who rebuked the governor for his cruelty, warned that the Iranian nation deserved justice and public security, and called for the lifting of the state's draconian price controls. Further, he declared that both the common law, as enforced by the state, and the Islamic law, as practiced by the mujtahids, must comply with the law, or kanun, a notion new to Iranian audiences. If the Shah is a true Muslim, he stressed, he too must comply with the people's wishes. The demands epitomized the predicament of a revolution that his sermon served to inaugurate. These bold claims were bound to agitate the pro-state ulama. In the midst of Jamal al-Din's sermon, the government-appointed imam of the Tehran Friday Mosque, outraged by the preacher's outspokenness, ordered him forcefully pulled from the pulpit and expelled. Subsequently, the club-wielding government guards rushed into the mosque and drove out the protesting crowd. The next day, some of the ulama who had been present at the gathering and were offended by the government's overreaction left the city in symbolic protest and took sanctuary, or bust, in the local shrine of Abd al-Azim south of the capital. The shrine soon became the centre of protest, and the population of Tehran came in droves to sympathise with the protesters. The incident marked the beginning of a popular movement that eventually came to be recognised as the Constitutional Revolution, or Enqalabi Mashrute, a transformational experience with major consequences for 20th century Iran. The previously described episode highlights most, if not all, of the elements that would shape the revolution. Merchants and artisans resentful of an inefficient and intrusive state, the lower and middle-ranking mullahs of various shades calling on the mujtahids to come out in support of the people, the Qajar state's desperate reactions to demands for popular participation and eventually for a constitution, and finally the large size of the urban population. To these groups were added in due course the Western-educated elite, who joined the indigenous radical elements and helped shape the parliament, or majils, and frame the modern constitution. The emerging constitutional movement, with its distinctive pluralistic features that allowed for diverse social and political groups to participate, however, soon ran counter to a royalist front that, backed by Imperial Russia, aimed to reassert the power of an autocratic Qajar Shah and preserve the privileges of the ruling elite. The revolution also contested the privileges of the very clerical class that first came to its support, but soon changed course as the constitution and the majils imposed limits on the mujtahid sphere of authority and defined the boundaries of the Sharia. The outcome was a multifaceted struggle that helped define Iran's modern national identity, emerging first in the civil war of 1908 to 1909 and continuing in the 2 decades before the rise of Reza Shah and establishment of the Pahlavi order in 1925. In these respects, the Constitutional Revolution was unrivaled in the history of the modern Middle East. Neither the Young Turks Revolution in 1908 nor the anti-colonial movements in Egypt in 1919 and elsewhere in the Arab world after World War I shared the extent of the Constitutional Revolution's grassroots base. During the 5 decades of Pahlavi rule, many of the political achievements of the Constitutional Revolution would be compromised by the arbitrary conduct of the state. Later, the Islamic Revolution of 1979 abrogated the Constitution of 1906 altogether. Yet the Constitutional Revolution remains a turning point in the history of Iran, above all because it marked a step forward on the path to socio-political modernity. Under the veneer of Western liberalism and constitutional order, the revolution tried to offer indigenous answers to a distinctly Perso-Shiite problem of social justice that had long been present in the milieu of Iranian descent. In effect, the revolution sought to secularize Shiite millenarian aspirations by incorporating such modern concepts as nationalism, the rule of law, limits to state power, individual rights, and people's representation. The revolution juxtaposed these principles with the ancient vestiges of kingship in the clerical establishment. The civil war of 1908 to 1909 between the constitutionalists and the royalists was the climax of a revolutionary struggle, for it weakened Qajar rule and relegated, at least temporarily, the conservative clergy to the political wilderness. The turmoil caused by the revolution, however, was compounded by the European threat of military occupation before and during World War I, which brought an abrupt end to the constitutional experiment and dampened revolutionary aspirations. Is there anything you want to add to that passage I've just read?
No, not really. The beginning of the revolution, as you said in the beginning, started with the sugar merchants being detained by the government and actually being tortured on authority of the Shah, because I think it was a crown prince who had them detained and tortured publicly because the economy was very bad and prices and inflation in the economy were skyrocketing. And so what did the government do in reaction to that? They targeted merchants who they suspected of, hiking up prices, hoarding goods and stuff like that. That's kind of the context of why this initial protest of the sugar merchants were happening and the reaction of the public, because the public reacted to this as these are good, upstanding citizens and honest people, and the government is targeting them because the economy was very bad and they thought they were cracking down on, hoarding and price hikes.
No, certainly. And just to add a bit more, so the specific prince, it wasn't the crown prince, it was another Qajar prince called Ayn al-Dawla, who was the governor of Tehran. And the torture they were subject to was a practice called bastinado, or foot whipping. It was a particularly cruel punishment to be meted out, and that's why people reacted so vociferously. So people came to the Friday Mosque to show sympathy and protest these arrests, and you sort of are starting to get more vocal regime critics. Like it was mentioned in that passage there that you had Jamal ad-Din Istahani, so he was the cleric, and he writes a tract called Libas al-Taqwa, or An Attire of Virtue, and he's calling for, this was a few years before the revolution, 1900, so he's calling for the public to start wearing domestic clothing and avoid importing European fabric, and leaning more into this idea of, the merchants becoming more politically active and organized. He establishes an organization known as the Anjuman-e-Taraqi, or the Progress Society, which is a secret society that advocates for the domestic cloth production. And he also helps persuade merchants in Isfahan to set up a organization called the Sharakat-e-Islamiyeh, or Islamic Company, a organization that would issue stocks and raise capital for the domestic production of cloth. And what's interesting is that the Sharakat was a very novel institution, because traditional Islamic law only recognized sort of transactions between individuals. So they didn't normally recognize, companies or, consortiums or combinations.
It was the first limited liability company in the Islamic world.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a brand new method of organization for the merchant classes, which will make them more potent in terms of their ability to critique and process the government. And what's also interesting is this links back to something I said in an earlier episode, that you're seeing the reaction to the imposition of free trade by the British on the country, and the Iranians are starting to become based and list pills.
Yeah, but not fast enough. And we should probably talk about the economy, because it was a very large reason why the public and the merchants were becoming more and more anti-government at this time. The economy in the late 19th century, very early 20th century, between 1890 to 1908, the economy was incredibly bad. The Iranian currency, the Tuman, lost 30% of its value in 1 year just because of the crash on the American silver market. Because the Tuman, the Iranian currency, was a silver-based currency. The price of silver collapses, I think in like 1890 something. The price of silver collapses, and the Iranian currency loses 30% of its value in just 1 year. And over the next decade, it would continue to lose its value precipitously, like very, very much so, reaching like 90+% against the British pound in the span of like less than 2 decades. And this is on top of the enormous government debts that the Qajar state was accumulating at this time. The Imperial Bank of Persia and the Russian Mortgage Bank were giving out multi-million-dollar loans to Iran while it was experiencing huge amounts of inflation, a very bad economy, not collecting enough tax revenue, and just an enormous trade deficit with all the other European powers. So this is kind of the backdrop of all these things were compounding, and the economy was very bad, and this was very much impacting the quality of life of people, particularly the merchants and middle classes.
Yeah, usury beyond your wildest imaginations, eh?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, so that's sort of the economic backdrop, but I want to look a little bit at the sort of intellectual undergirding of the revolution, and the sort of the thoughts that are going on at this time, because there's very much two camps. You've got a much more, I would say, kind of Western aligned sort of revolutionary camp. With these are people who are influenced by a lot of Western intellectual thought, and so just to look at sort of these people for a moment. So a lot of these were like expats, so these are Persians, Iranians who are going overseas to Europe, or a lot of them actually are in Russian Azerbaijan, so only over the border, and they're being influenced by a lot of the thought leaders there. And a lot of them were arguing for public education, and they wanted to also replace the Shikaste script that the Persian was using, as they thought it was too cumbersome for mass use. They also desired to do things, improve public health, combat disease and malnutrition, understandably considering all of the various disease, especially cholera outbreaks throughout the 19th century, as well as famines. Obviously, Malcolm Khan is a key figure we've talked about previously, but he's still around at this point. So he was very much influenced by Auguste Comte and his ideas on positivism. And he creates this sort of creed called the Adamiyat, or the Humanity Creed, which he argues that Iran should move towards scientific progress, human rights, and tolerance. And he even publishes a periodical to push his ideas known as the Kanun. And to move over to another side of the sort of ideological ledger, you have people such as Afghani, who was a sort of a more of a Islamic reformer, where he wanted the political development of Iran to follow a more Islamic route, and essentially allow Persians or Iranians to become a religio-national group of resistance against foreign domination. And he sends letters to Mojdahad Shirazi, known as the Shabnameh, or the Nocturnal Letters, and these were circulated around mosques and other public buildings. And Afghani was actually financed and supported by Abdul Hamid II, and he was actually dying exiled in Constantinople in 1897. And he was, as you can imagine, extremely anti-British. And you sort of see a synthesis between Malcolm Khan and Afghani in this figure I have here on the left, Mirza Akbar Khan Kamani. So he was a nationalist, and he believed that Iran's glories were in the past, so essentially pre-Islamic conquest, and so very anti-Arab, very anti-Islamic. His family were of Sufi origins, and they had connections to Zoroastrianism and Babism, and he was versed in the ideas of Mullah Sadra. As you can see, he's got this very kind of philosophical backdrop to himself, and he wrote sort of several articles in the publications known as Acta, while he himself was also in exile in Constantinople. So it's just interesting, just showing the influence the developments in the Ottoman Empire are having on Iran. You've got people like Afghani who are being sponsored by Abdul Hamid, but at the same time you've got people like Khamenei who are clearly being influenced by ideas such as the Tanzimat. And he's later is extradited to Iran after Nasruddin Shah's assassination, and he's tried and executed as an accomplice to the revolutionary action against the crown by the Crown Prince and later Shah Muhammad Ali Mirza. And Khamenei would later be viewed as a martyr of the constitutional revolution. And another sort of prominent expat is this figure on the right, Mirza Fakhr Ali Akhundzadeh. So he was an Azeri playwright who lived in Tiflis, modern Georgia, and was another agitator for reform. And he was an adherent of Deism, which is essentially a more secularized version of religion. It's essentially, from my understanding, it's where you argue that all of nature is downstream from some higher divine being, but you're not necessarily subscribed to any strong religious practice. If I've understood that right, Hunger.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I would just like to add, just on 2 points, Istanbul was very much the center of Iranian dissidents. It was places like Istanbul and Calcutta, actually, that were the 2 main centers, and sometimes Beirut. Beirut is mentioned quite a few times. I don't know why so many dissidents go to Beirut, but these are the 2 main centers of Persian dissidents, of intellectuals who don't like the Qajar regime, and they are given the freedom to openly discuss ideas. And a lot of Persian language newspapers actually get started in Istanbul that are then transported over to Persia to influence the more intellectual classes over there. These radical newspapers coming out of Istanbul, coming back to Persia and influencing the intellectuals there. But the interesting thing about these 2 figures you have on screen, Khamenei and Akhundzadeh, is Khamenei is very moderate when it comes to Islam, but Akhundzadeh was like a radical secularist. And funny thing about Akhundzadeh is that he was actually an employee of the Russian civil service. He was in exile. I think he was Azeri, and he was working in the Tiflis administration under the Russian Tsar, obviously. And he wrote a lot of plays as well. And he was much more anti-Islam than I would say Khamenei was. And that's something to consider, that all these intellectuals are either moderate or openly against, Islam when it comes to their influence on the revolution.
Well, with Akhundzadeh, he blames Shia Islam for the cause of the decline of Persian civilization and responsible for things such as slavery, torture, and the mistreatment of women. So, and he also seems to have what I could only describe as a kind of cultural self-hatred, where he saw Iran's decline as a result of its own culture and religious practices, and not as a result of what some viewed as Western subversion and domination. So there was which is a very, very interesting angle to come from, isn't it?
He was also because he was a subject of the Russian Empire. He was living in a very ascendant empire that was getting much larger and much richer and much more successful than Iran. Persia was a shrinking empire, and he saw the benefits of westernization in Russia. Not Russia. He was in the Caucasus, the Russian-controlled areas of the Caucasus. So that's something to definitely consider in his psychology.
No, of course, certainly, and many other Caucasian revolutionaries. I'm looking at you, Bolsheviks, would emerge and wreak havoc in Iran in the years to come. And so it's from that point that I want to again start looking at the revolution proper, because obviously we've talked about the kind of the economic grievances, but and of course we've been going through these ideological origins. So this is the more sort of reformist side of the revolutionaries. I now want to look at the other side, the more conservative side, because I have here 2 clerics, Sayyid Muhammad Tabatabai and Sayyid Abdullah Bebahani. So these were both mujtahids, and these were what are known as reformist mujtahids. So they still believe that Iran should be a Shiite Islamic country, but they also saw the need to reform the system as deleterious to the state of the country. And they actually were seen as kind of the symbolic leaders of the revolution, and they there was a nickname for them. They were known as the two glowing stars. So again, you've got this very broad coalition. You've got these these Western intellectuals, but then you've also got these sort of indigenous reformist clergy as well. And
something we'll see later on in the 79 revolution, I should mention, an alliance of Western liberals and some of the mullahs, although they all had their own reasons for supporting the revolution.
And certainly, and it's probably worth looking at, because the clergy are broken down. You've got the more conservative clergy who don't want any change at all because they see it as a threat to their own power, and then you have these reformists. And so one example, so we've mentioned the Isfahani fellow. Well, he, along with another cleric called Malek al-Mutakallamin, they anonymously published an anti-Mujtahid text known as the Roya-i Sadaqeh, or A Truthful Dream, which accuses the mullahs of greed, corruption, and oppression via the use of takfir, or excommunication, to kill and plunder their enemy's property. I mean, indeed, this is how the Mujtahids end up becoming so wealthy. If you fall out with them, they'll prescribe you via this takfir process, and then have their looties kill and take your property away from you. And so, and they were also accused of exacerbating famine by hoarding grain, and also for obstructing reforms which were deemed quote-unquote un-Islamic. However, Isfahani was more respectful to the reformist Mujtahids, such as the two figures I have here on screen. And he would eventually actually be assassinated in 1908, and he also directed a lot of criticism towards the Qajar elite itself via a newspaper he founded, which were later named in his honor, known as Al Jamal, which published his sermons. Another prominent reformist is a fellow called Yusuf Khan Mustashar al-Dawla, who publishes a work known as Yak Kalameh, or A Single Word, which argues for a French constitution with Islamic principles. And it's from this we get a core concept of this constitutional revolution, the concept of a mashruteh. So mashruteh is the Farsi or Persian word for constitution, but it's more than that. What they mean by constitution, they don't just mean a parliament or a government with representative institutions. They mean something like in that vein, but one that is undergirded by Shiite Islamic principles. And obviously this is a significant turn because, as we've discussed in previous episodes in the series, historically the clergy were against involvement in politics because they saw it as, corrupting. It is wrong for a man of the cloth to engage in, the physical world, so to speak. So it just goes to show you how bad the situation in Iran became by the fact that now some of them are deciding, well, we can no longer adopt this policy of non-interference in politics. We need to, if we want to ensure an Iran that serves the interests of the people and of Shia Islam as a whole.
No, absolutely. And their solution to this, they came to the solution through many ways. The Western educated liberals and the reformists in the mullahs, they kind of settled on the idea of the House of Justice. The House of Justice, or the National Assembly, which is called the Mejlis. The National Assembly is what we mean when we say the Parliament, and this would be bound by the laws of Sharia, and it would have genuine political power, and all the important notables and groups and factions of the Persian state would be represented in this parliament, this House of Justice.
No, certainly. Before we get into that, because there's a reading I want to do, I just also want to quickly go over the situation with the Barbies, because it was mentioned that some of these intellectuals, especially the more Western secular types, were crypto Barbies. Well, in a previous stream when we were looking at the reign of Muhammad Shah, obviously we covered the Barbie uprising in 1848 and 1849. So what happened after that point is the Barbies, essentially their split is permanently into two camps. We have what are known as the Barbie Azalis, or moderate or crypto Barbies, and then we have the Baha'is. And the difference is the Barbie Azalis were essentially kind of, or crypto Barbies were moderates that supported constitutionalism, and they rely heavily on the Shiite practice of taqiyya, or to precaution or dissemblement. This is a key pillar of Shia Islam. Sorry,
lying.
Yes, essentially. It is justified for us to lie and deceive in order to achieve our spiritual objectives. Because what happens is the Barbie Azalis survive into the 20th century because they present themselves as ordinary everyday Muslims, just ones with what you might say reformist or revolutionary political goals, whereas the Baha'is, who outright break with Shiism and declare their own faith, are persecuted by the Qajar establishment and the mullahs. Indeed, around this time, there was a grisly purge of thousands of Baha'is in the city of Yazd in 1903. So as we can see here, I think the Barbie Azalis were a much more successful movement because they employed this more pragmatic strategy of taqiyya.
Yeah, what happened in the city of Yazd in 1902 and 1903 was very bad. With the approval of the mujtahids, the more conservative mujtahids, a lot of the looties, surprise, surprise, the looties started looting. I wonder where they get that term from, actually. But no, the looties started looting the businesses, the houses, the residences of many of these suspected Baha'i figures, and like hundreds of people were killed, and actually hundreds more, thousands more were made refugees and exiled from the city. And there was some gruesome stuff. Women and children were dying of hunger and thirst out in the countryside because they were driven into exile. And it was very bad what happened to the Baha'i in Yazd.
No, exactly. And it's just interesting, isn't it, that if you look at the modern Islamic Republic, I mean, all of Iran's historical minority religions, so Zoroastrians, Christians, and even Jews, are constitutionally protected religions. The Baha'i are not a constitutionally protected religion, so you can see how long that enmity has lasted.
Yeah, the regime is always more the regime is always more aggressive against the heretic than it is against the Christians or the Jews or the Zoroastrians, because those were always there to begin with. The Baha'i were heretical Muslims, and that was just intolerable.
No, exactly. And as also be noted, those are not the only kind of ethnic massacres. I mean, around this time, there was actually a massacre of Mizrahi Jews in places like Shiraz because, there was an alleged incident of blood libel, which results in massacres. So you've got that as well.
I'm not going to dispute the veracity of that. I will take your word for it.
No, people are interested in the Iranians' relationship with their Jewish population and the state of Israel. Please check out a stream I did with Pete Quinones about 6 months ago. And from there, I do want to do a bit of a reading as we're getting into the revolution proper. So from a segment from the House of Justice to the National Assembly. The dissidents in exile had only an indirect impact on the course of the constitutional movement, and this was mostly through domestic activists. Enjoying the blessing of the two high-ranking mujtahids, Behbahani and Tabatabai, the activists among middle and lower-ranking mullahs made more demands on the state. This helped turn an initially limited protest movement with mundane aims into a national outcry for a constitution, popular representation, and civil rights. These ideas, adopted by a handful of advocates from such sources as Malcolm Khan's Kanun and the fictional travelogue of Ibrahim Bag by Marig Hay, were communicated to high-ranking clerical leaders and then passed down to the general public. Sayyid Mohammed Tabatabai's support for constitutionalism, rooted in his admirably liberal predilections, were atypical among the jurists of the period. His ally, Sayyid Abdullah Behbahani, however, seemed to have been driven as much by ambitions of leadership and alleged monetary concerns as by aspirations for democracy. Both leaders belonged to families who had enjoyed social distinction for more than a century. At the outset, they relied heavily on their better-informed subordinates for their knowledge of such notions as civil rights, legislation, and national sovereignty, but their courage and prestige made them enormously popular with the public. Tabatabai, in particular, was endowed with a genuine urge to establish a pluralistic society based on the rule of law and individual freedoms, concepts that he himself acknowledged as inconsistent with the best interests of the Mojtahad class. The early absence of a coherent political agenda among the protesters is evident. For instance, in the set of demands set forth in December 1905 during the Bast Sanctuary that was organised in response to the government's treatment of sugar merchants, the most significant demand was a call to establish a House of Justice, or Adalat Khaneh, which would be compatible with Sharia and would protect subjects in the state arbitrary measures, especially in collecting taxes. Yet the list of demands also included such seemingly mundane items as dismissal of a notorious carriage driver who monopolised the route between Tehran and the nearby shrine of Shah Abdalazim, and whose uncouth conduct generated many complaints from the pilgrims. No mention, however, was made of the canon, law or constitution, division of powers or creation of a legislative assembly. Even the concept of the House of Justice was not particularly favoured by many, for it implied a potential departure from the decentralised judicial courts that the ulama had long cherished. The notion of the House of Justice, which eventually transformed into a call for a national assembly, had its roots in the writings of the Bab and the messianic aspiration to establish a House of Justice, Bait al-Adl, under the Imam of the age. At the beginning of the constitutional movement in 1905 AD was only 6 years before the millennial anniversary of the Great Occultation, Gaibati Kubra, of the Hidden Imam, who was presumed to have gone into occultation in 941 AD, added to the messianic spirit of the moment and to the anticipation of the return of the Mahdi. This was evident in many statements, names of a number of newspapers, and the sermons of the pro-constitutional preachers. In effect, the awakening or Bidari of the people, often referred to in the literature of the period, and their demand for the establishment of a just order implied some form of modernization, or more specifically, democratization of a messianic paradigm and its utopian ideals that were indigenous to the Iranian environment. Dispensing justice and adalat in the world to redress wrongs and remove tyranny, one of the precepts of Shia Islam with a millenarian connotation, was soon adopted by a new generation of European educated state elites and complemented by European notions of the rule of law and limits on the despotic power of the state. Domesticating these Western notions in the Shiite political space enabled the growth and early success of the constitutional movement. Yet from the start, it also injected into the process inherent ambiguity, even some resistance to divulging the true secular agenda of the constitutionalists, by somewhat naively trying to dress many articles of the emerging constitution in Islamic garb, not dissimilar to Moshtahar al-Dawla's Yak Kalameh. The constitution activists hoped to appease the conservatives and escape labels of heresy and religious innovation. As such, they introduced a troubling feature to the Iranian experience of democracy, one that would remain inherent for decades and not for a whole century thereafter. The Joseph Naus affair offered a pretext for expressing indignation at and discontent with a foreign presence. As the Belgian director of Iranian customs under Muzaffar ad-Din Shah since 1897, Naus had restricted Iranian customs and raised state revenue through higher tariffs and a rigorous collection of duties, yet public discontent with his regime was expressed in Islamic ethical terms. He had appeared at a European costume ball in Tehran in Persian traditional attire, remotely resembling that of the ulama. The widely distributed photograph of him in costume smoking the Persian water pipe became a source of outrage in his dismissal of one of the demands of the protesters in Qum. The protest was fueled and possibly financed by Iranian merchants resentful of Naus's discriminatory practices, which favoured Russian firms. His partiality to Russia was reciprocated by Russia's extension of near-protege status to Belgians and threatening the Iranian government with retaliation for any action taken against Naus practices or against his amassing personal wealth. Yet even after his departure in May 1907, the outcome of public protest, the Belgians' grip on customs remained firm. It's just interesting, isn't it, that you've got this Belgian kind of committing, dare I say it, a kind of a cultural appropriation, and then you have the Persians sort of chimping out over it.
Cultural appropriation, and some maybe a little bit of siphoning of public funds, maybe just a little bit. The Russians were very adamant in protecting the Belgians, very much so, because they were also protecting their own investments in Iran.
But it's also interesting, isn't it, that you can understand maybe the great power of the Russians and the British fleecing Iran, but the bloody Belgians doing it as well.
Every single time it's the Belgians. But I believe there's a super chat we should probably get to.
Yes, well, there was actually one before the stream as well. So Rong Tao Wu for $2. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you, Rong Tao Wu. And Distant Night for 5 Australian dollars. I've been told the Baha'i don't exist. I know this isn't true because I have a Baha'i friend. Where does that nonsense come from? I imagine it's probably the mullahs or something who are perpetuating that. A distant night.
I've never heard of Baha'i denialism. This is new to me.
Well, it makes sense for the mullahs to deny them, isn't it? I mean, hell, they deny them in the constitution, so it would make sense that they would deny them in reality.
I mean, they have a page on Wikipedia. They were not all exiled. I'm sure there are still Baha'is in Iran today.
No, perhaps a darker reading of that is, yes, the Baha'i don't exist because they were all murdered in Iran and they had to go abroad.
Oh, there are many abroad. That I can confirm. But yeah.
No, I think like 99% of all Baha'i are outside Iran, predominantly in India.
Oh, that's true. No, that is true. Yes.
And if we're doing super chats, Rong Talwu did send one on my entropy yesterday, which hasn't come through because I wasn't streaming at the time, but he did send me a screenshot of it. So I'm just going to read that. One moment. Oh, hang on. I think he might have deleted it. Oh, okay. Oh, never mind. He'd sent me a screenshot. He must have deleted it. Oh, well. Unfortunately, my revenue page on Entropy is locked, so I've asked them to unlock it, and hopefully I might be able to read that at some point in the future. Yeah, well, let's carry on with this reading. So, the protest was fueled and possibly financed by Iranian merchants. Sorry, wrong bit. In July 1906, a renewed call for the government to convene a Sharia-bound assembly, or Majlis, of the House of Justice regained momentum. In support of the Majlis, the restive Tehran population gathered in Tukhana Square, adjacent to the Citadel complex, and staged one of the earliest public demonstrations that had occurred outside the mosque or the shrine setting. The clampdown on demonstrators by government troops resulted in the death of a young religious student, offering a pretext to a group of pro-constitutionalist ulama headed by Tabatabai to leave the capital and reside in Qum. The ulama's departure in protest was always treated with anxiety by the Qajar government, especially in times of crisis. Simultaneously, the merchants of the Tehran Bazaar rallied behind Bebahani, who had ties with the British legation in Tehran, played a crucial role in the burgeoning protest movement. Fearing government retaliation, the Tehran merchants managed to organise a vast sanctuary, or bust, in support of the Qum protesters in the safety of the British legation in Tehran. Interesting development, eh?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that last part?
Oh, so essentially what the protesters do in solidarity with the protesters in Qum, they all take refuge in the British legation in Tehran.
Oh, yes.
Which I pictured here.
The sanctuary.
Yes, and what you see in this image, these are all big cauldrons of rice that are being brought in to feed them.
No, the protesters taking sanctuary at the British Embassy, this was unprecedented. This was a huge deal, because I mean you have to take yourself back to the 1900s in a Muslim country like Qajar, Persia, that you have these political dissidents, these merchants who are protesting and calling for political reform in the system. They are running to a European power. They are running to a European embassy for sanctuary from the state, a non-Muslim state. This is unprecedented. This was very radical of them, actually, at the time. But they had the support of the public. And the British Embassy, the British Embassy was in, I wouldn't say complicit, but they were in tacit support. They couldn't really do anything about thousands of people taking refuge. Well, maybe they could have, but it might have been too politically explosive for them to react. And this was also a way of signaling, actually. The British were actually interested in signaling to the regime that they were getting too close to the Russians and that Britain would tolerate these dissidents if Qajar, Persia continued to get closer to the Russians.
No, that's my thoughts exactly, because ultimately at this time, because we mentioned the Young Turk Revolution, but another political event is obviously you have the 1905 Russian Revolution that was happening during the Russo-Japanese War. So the Russian Empire, who's the main backer of the Qajar monarchy, is embroiled in not only a war with Japan I should also note a proxy war effectively with Britain, because the Anglo-Japanese alliance had been signed a couple of years earlier in 1902. So Britain is pulling off this proxy war in the Far East where Russia is humiliated, when the Japanese, not only sink their Pacific fleet, but when the Russians send their Baltic fleet all the way around the world, that also gets sunk as well. So Russia has suffered this humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese. Then they've got this, revolution in 1905, which is also cracked down on. And so the Russians are embattled, and the British are saying, "Oh, this is an excellent opportunity for us to perhaps support people for regime change in Iran, because the weakening of the Qajar monarchy weakens the Russian position."
No, 100%. And this is true at the time. The Persians are getting much closer to Russia in the Great Game, although that would come to an end in 1907. We'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, Sir Edward Grey, who was, I believe it was the foreign minister at the time in Britain, if you can correct me.
So the Liberals come in late 1905, and Grey would serve as foreign secretary until Lloyd George would come in late 1916. So
yeah, Sir Edward Grey was very instrumental in maintaining this line of not wanting to. I mean, how do I say it? Not wanting to regime change the Qajars, but supporting the dissidents. Keeping that line just to keep them, in check with the Russians. And he was pretty much the mastermind behind that.
It's interesting because I just want to draw a comparison, because last week I did a stream of Apostolic Majesty on the sort of German and Ottoman relations leading up to World War One, and we talked about the Young Turk Revolution, and this is a credible moment where the Germans have been building this very amicable relationship with Abdul Hamid, and then with his deposition, you see this threat to that relationship, and many of the Young Turks were ideologically sympathetic to the British and saw Britain as the model they wanted to take the empire down. And what's so sort of tragicomic is the British had no interest whatsoever in working with the Young Turks, and they saw them as essentially the French Revolution on the Bosphorus, basically. And there's this passage from the Sean McMeekin book, The Berlin-Baghdad Railway, that I was reading 2 a.m. and essentially the British ambassador, or rather dragoman at the port, Fitzmaurice, essentially was buying into this conspiracy theory that the Young Turks were Donmer. Again, for those who didn't listen to that stream, Donmer are crypto Jews, so they're Ottoman Jews who have nominally converted to Islam but retain many sort of crypto Jewish beliefs and practices. So there's this conspiracy theory that all the Young Turks are these crypto Jewish radical revolutionaries, and Fitzmaurice is saying we shouldn't be supporting these sort of subversives in the Ottoman government. And I loved AM's response. Is what is this, the Protocols of Zion or something? And I wish I'd said at the time, well, we've just entered the 1907 pact with the Russians. Perhaps they sent us a few copies of it.
Yeah, I'm going to believe that's true, because I think there's I'm aware of this conspiracy theory, and I think there is some evidence to support it, but I choose to believe it's true, even if it's not.
well, to draw another comparison, we've got crypto-Jewish revolutionaries, but it's like crypto-Jewish revolutionaries in the Ottoman Empire and crypto-Barbie revolutionaries in Qajar, Iran.
Yes. Oh, we'll get to the crypto Bobby revolutionaries. There's a very based passage by I need to read, but we'll get to that. So at the British Embassy, yes, there are thousands of merchants and protesters taking sanctuary. But I think the last thing we can say about this is that this was actually a very interesting period when they were there, because they started discussing ideas freely and openly. There was a modicum of free speech at the British Embassy that they couldn't have outside the British Embassy. And a lot of these, intellectuals were discussing the ideas of how do we create a constitution? How do we create a national assembly? And this was very, very furtive ground for them to discuss these ideas openly and publicly.
Oh, no, certainly. And I just want to carry on reading that point that I'd stopped at. So, taking sanctuary on the grounds of European power was an unprecedented, even sacrilegious move, more so because it was in the British legation that the protesters openly demanded for the first time the establishment of a constitutional Masrute order. The Bast attracted a crowd from all walks of life, particularly from the bazaar guilds, small merchants and artisans. Altogether, there was about 500 tents representing trades and professions, as humble as cobblers, porcelain menders, and fresh walnut vendors. On the final day, as many as 14,000 individuals. The atmosphere was joyous but orderly, and the mood congenial and optimistic. The chief merchants of the bazaar sustained the cost of the tents and food for the public for the full 2 weeks of the Bast. Massive copper cauldrons were brought from the mosques and the takiers and placed on makeshift hearths in common kitchen to prepare huge quantities of rice stew and Persian ash, which were delivered on trays to the tents, whose banners identified guilds and other organizations. There were also frequent sermons and speeches highlighting the evils of tyranny and the benefits of a constitution. I should also add another point why the British may not have wanted to have counter-signaled the protesters. I wonder if they wanted to avoid the Russian embassy incident after the fourth Russo-Persian War, when the Lutis stormed the Russian embassy and massacred everyone.
Yeah, there was that too. There's definitely that context in the background as well. Although this would would be a trend of dissidents fleeing to embassies. This is the first time it happens in Persia.
Oh, well, it's interesting because we may not ever discuss this in the series. I'll mention it now, but there was actually an incident in 2013 where Britain actually cut off all diplomatic ties with Iran, and it's because members of the Revolutionary Guard stormed the British embassy in Tehran and vandalized it. So this did actually happen in history quite recently, funnily enough. So
yeah, no, we'll get to the embassy dramas of the revolution much later in this series.
Well, no, that was 2013, so this was much more recently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, crazy stuff. But yeah, I'll carry on. So the process was novel above all because the central role of the merchants. They took the lead from constitutional activists in persuading the ranking mujtahids to comply with the idea of the constitution. Even more than the tobacco protest 15 years earlier, the merchant class was the engine behind the protesters and the voicing of their grievances. Moreover, the Bast enjoyed the tacit support of some middle-ranking British diplomats in Tehran. Facing the protesters' enthusiasm and their growing numbers, British diplomats could do little but allow the Bast to proceed unhindered. The British blessing, momentarily though it was, hinted towards a shift in the British Foreign Office's policy in Iran under Sir Edward Grey, a subtle response to Russia's increasing commercial and political influence in Iran and to the Qajar court's tilt towards its northern neighbour. As far as the constitutionalists were concerned, the Bast in delegation offered not only immunity against the government and the blessing of a European power, but also a secular space, one outside the mosque and religious sanctuaries. The relative freedom in the new space allowed Western-educated intellectuals and graduates of the Dar al-Fonum to help refashion the idea of the House of Justice into a demand for a European-style constitution. The coinage mashrute, in fact, meant conditional, denoting the setting of conditions on the power of the sovereign. Borrowing from the neighbouring Ottoman Empire's first constitutional regime of 1876, which was aborted in 1878 by the Sultan Abdul Hamid, Meşrutiyet, as it pronounced in Ottoman Turkish, represented for the Iranians more than just the new conditional system. It represented the entire constitutional experience and political order it entailed. The term mashrute, moreover, implies a familiar chapter on conditions, or shurut, in Islamic law, which in turn gave it a certain Islamic acceptability, and in the eyes of the ulama and the public put it at a safe distance from such alien notions as constitution and constitutionalism. Public debate and publication further gave the term mashrute and associated buzzwords a greater currency. The growing telegraphic communications throughout Iran's major cities made it possible for protesters in the capital to transmit the constitutional message of the movement and to coordinate their efforts with cohorts in Tabriz, the true centre of radical activism, and elsewhere. Thus, the movement was no longer seen as a quarrel between the ulama and the Qajar state. It had acquired a nationwide constituency that was increasingly becoming conscious of its message and its national identity. Long live Iran, a rallying cry of the constitutionalists from the earliest days touched on such patriotic sentiments. As has often been noted, only a small number of the elite understood the idea of the constitution and the liberal values associated with it, yet the Iranian public was quick to employ the term to air its resentment of the destitution, material decline, and their insecurities they face in everyday life. For these ills, the people held the ruling establishment responsible. If notions of constitutional rights and democratic representation were new to them, poverty and decline and state arbitrary rule were familiar. It is rather naive to blame the ordinary people, as critics of the constitutional revolution often have, for the unfamiliarity with the lofty liberal ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, or John Stuart Mill, it is even more condescending to expect that all revolutions would have a standard interpretation of modernity. The sanctuary in Qum, protests in Tehran, and mediation between the majorité seekers and the royal court by moderate statesmen obligated the weary Shah and his court officials to dismiss the unpopular premier Ayn al-Dawla, whose draconian measures triggered the earlier protests. He was the third member of the Qajar tribe in the century to serve as premier and stir a crisis. Later in 1908, his part in quashing the revolutionary resistance in Tabriz further blackened his image as a staunch reactionary. Shortly thereafter, the protesting ulama who had taken refuge in Qum returned after the Shah only implicitly accepted their demands. Yet on August 10, 1906, under increased public pressure, he could see no other way but to issue a rescript that came to be known as the Constitutional Decree, Farmani Mashrutiyat, addressed to the new premier, Nasrullah Khan Mushir al-Dawla. The receipt called for the establishment of a National Consultative Assembly, Majlis-i-Shura Yemeli, to carry out the requisite deliberations and investigations on all necessary subjects connected with important affairs of the state and empire and the public interests, and shall render the necessary help and assistance to our cabinet and ministers in such reforms as are designed to promote the happiness and well-being of Iran. Although, ironically, the word mashruteh was carefully avoided in the rescript, the text did speak, albeit vaguely, of legislative reforms, and further endorsed that the Majlis, first with any representation beyond the elite, be elected from among 7 classes: the princes of the Qajar family, the ulama, the notables or ayan, the nobles, ashraf, the landowners, the merchants and the guilds. The Electoral Law Committee, appointed to draw up election bylaws, consisted of mostly young Western-educated bureaucrats. Among them were Mahdi Koli Hedayat and Hassan Mushir al-Mulk, later Mushir al-Dawla Purnia, liberal moderates with family histories of divan service over several generations. The latter was a graduate of the Russian Military Academy and student of law who had founded the School of Diplomacy in Tehran in 1899. Perhaps inspired by the model of the Estates General during the French Revolution, the committee opted for a representational system that surprisingly gave the greatest number of deputies, vakils, to the guilds and the merchants. Of the 168 deputies, Tehran was designated 60 seats, 4 of which were to go to the Qajar princes and nobles, 4 to the ulama and students Tolab, 10 to the khans and landowners, 10 to the merchants, and 1 each to the 32 guilds. Azerbaijan and Fars were to receive 12 seats each, and the remaining 10 provinces 82 seats. By September, the electoral law was ratified and the designated deputies began to convene in the capital. The inauguration of the Majlis in October 1906 aimed to frame the fundamental law, Kanun-i-Asasi. Remarkably, the issuance of the Constitutional Decree and the convening of the Majlis closely resembled the developments during the 1905 Russian Revolution and the establishment of the short-lived Duma in April 1906. Adopting the term fundamental law also seems to have been inspired by the fundamental laws issued by Tsar Nicholas II, according to which the Duma was granted limited legislative powers, but only with the ultimate endorsement of the Tsar, who called himself the supreme autocrat. Similar tensions between the Majlis and the monarch were soon to emerge with the Iranian constitutional revolution. The members of the Electoral Law Committee adopted the term fundamental law in place of the French constitution so as to avoid conservatives' accusations that they were adopting an alien constitution contrary to Islamic Sharia and the tradition of monarchy in Iran. Yet the secularizing agenda of the constitutionalists, boosted by the dissident preachers and the burgeoning liberal press outside the Majlis, was clear enough not to be linked by opponents, even though a handful of radical deputies led by the likes of Hassan Taqizadeh, the celebrated deputy from Tabriz, did their best to camouflage their anti-royalist and anti-clerical views. Fearing their opponents in the courts and among conservative ulama, the Majlis deputies soon realized that they had to avoid the fate of the Russian Duma, which was dissolved in July 1906 by order of the Tsar. They had only a brief window of opportunity. The Majlis thus hastily drew up a document to be signed by the Shah on December the 30th, 1906, on his deathbed. The fundamental law recognized the separation of 3 powers, with the Majlis as the legislative body, far more than earlier demands for it have been a mere judicial function, and with the Shah as the head of the executive. The news of the revolution stirred some interest not only nationally, but in the European press as well. The Shah died of kidney failure on January 3rd, 1907, and was immediately succeeded on the throne by his son, Muhammad Ali Shah, a man of decidedly different temperament and political orientation from his father. Yeah, so as we can see there, we have this significant gain that's been made by the constitutionalists. For once in Persia's history, you have this true sort of public body that is there to represent all the different segments of society. So the Qajar dynasty, the different tribal khans, the nobility, the guilds, the ulama, and even even the religious minorities. So it was truly, dare I say it, an inclusive institution. And I just want to comment very quickly, because we haven't talked about Muzaffar ad-Din Shah very much, because when he comes in after his father's assassination, his reign is, it's mostly about just dealing with upheaval from various groups, and he doesn't do very much. There's only really two notable acts of his reign. One was the passing of the constitution and creation of the Majlis on his deathbed, because he would die of kidney failure in early 1907. But the other major act of his reign was the granting of the oil concession to William Knox Darcy in 1901, which would eventually culminate in the creation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and the discovery of oil at Masjid-i Soliman in 1908. But that's a story we'll elaborate on another day. And it's very interesting because Muzaffar ad-Din, he was actually of very poor health and of quite sort of a nervous disposition, and that's why I think he ultimately gave way to the pressure that was building here, and it also, I think, explains why he died so shortly afterwards.
Yeah, he was not I think it's widely agreed upon. He was not a very strong ruler, and he had to compromise much more, and was encouraged to compromise much more than his father did. His father was a much more savvy, strong ruler, even though he had made many mistakes. Muzaffar, his son, was not of the same character. After he died, after he dies in 1907, Muzaffar's son, I can't remember his name. It is Muhammad Ali Shah. Yes, Muhammad Ali Shah was much more similar to his grandfather. Very competitive, actually. But I think the last thing we should say about this topic on the Constitution and the Assembly, the Majlis, is I kind of want to address the elephant in the room, and it is that Amanat is writes about this topic very positively, almost too positively. He is very much a Persian liberal, and he sees this. Do you know what I'm getting at?
Yes, this is almost
very
like
much a partisan.
If I was to probe Abbas Armanat, if you read between the lines, he essentially views this as Iran's glorious revolution.
Yeah, the Constitution is the greatest thing that's ever happened in Persian history, and it was the most modern, progressive thing that the regime has ever done, and we need to go back to the Constitution. That's very much the elephant in the room. When I was reading this chapter, Amanat is and remains a total shitlip, although he is an excellent scholar.
Speaking of shitlib, this regime. Very despotic, clear signs of fascism.
Amazing. Yeah. But I am very excited to talk about the figure on the right, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. Probably the most based man at this period of time. But we'll get to that. Would you like to open that topic up?
No, go ahead. I need to rest my voice a bit anyway, so I'd love for you to elaborate on Nuri.
Yes. So let me just get my notes together. Yes, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. He was he is obviously one of the ulama. He is a mujtahid. He is part of that class. He is elected in the Majlis, the parliament, the Iranian parliament, after its creation, and he has a very interesting history. He was more of a moderate. He was actually an early supporter of the revolution. He was a supporter of the Constitutional Assembly. He was a supporter of the protests. In a limited capacity, the ulama did not like to interfere in politics, as we mentioned before. They did not like direct interference in the political process. But he was an early supporter of the revolution. He helped draft. He was there in all the meetings for the creation of the Majlis, the parliament, and surprise of all surprise, the liberals and radicals in parliament got so uppity that they could no longer hide their agenda, their radical liberal agenda at the time, and he turned against them. and Nuri became the head of the clerical anti-constitutional establishment. He became the leading figure in the Mejlis against the liberals, and he became a royalist. He's, at the beginning of his term, he was more moderate between the liberals and the Shah, but towards the end, he was decidedly the Shah's biggest supporter in the Mejlis against the liberals. And there's just one passage that I have to read that Amanat writes about. It's just I just found this passage hilarious. Hold on. 1 second. I believe it's... Yep, okay, I found it. Yes, I'll read the passage. Despite his early support for the constitutional movement, Nuri soon parted ways, posing a potent challenge to the Mejlis and the cause of constitutionalism. He coined the term mashrua, obviously mimicking mashrute, to imply that the Sharia, and not the shart condition, ought to be the foundation of the new constitutional order. Though a prominent Asuli jurist, he did not articulate the meaning of mashrua beyond generalities, perhaps aware of the past Shia jurists' aversion to engaging in issues of political governance. In the absence of the Imam of the age, they considered any form of worldly government to be categorically oppressive. Nuri remained in essence loyal to the theory of state-religion dual authority. Yet facing the reality of a modern legislature, he strove to find a role for the jurists, with himself at the helm. Not merely a judicial one, but a role to enforce the Sharia far beyond its accepted limits. He viewed the nascent Mejlis and its constitution as no more than a conspiracy hatched by heretics, Babis, and atheists, and he called on his clerical cohorts to oppose them. And that last line was my favorite line. the conspiracy of Babis, atheists, and liberals, and heretics, and he was 100% right.
Based.
Yeah, the liberal radicals in the Mejlis were not shy at times about, being incredibly pro-secularism and wanting to strip power and authority from the mujtahids.
Well, no, not only that, but also, we can't allow, all of these people are, influenced by foreign ideas which are subversive and are going to, undermine the guarded domains, so that, they cannot be allowed to be victorious. No,
absolutely. And he caught on to the fact very quickly that a lot of these people were Baha'i and Babi sympathizers, and that they were subversives from the very beginning. And that's why they were so adamantly supportive of a constitution and a parliament.
It should be noted, though, that he eventually drops his Mashrure concept once the constitution is give him a concession by allowing a 5-man Mojtahid advisory committee to the constitution. So I think there's an element of that this whole thing was a stick just to get his way, and once he got his way, he stopped being obstructive to them.
No, that's possible. That's possible. I mean, he would not live long. He would not live long after the revolution. Although it would, at this time, this is the very early stages of the Mejlis, the parliament, and these Persian notables and tribal chiefs and merchants and very prominent people who were elected, they're still trying to work out like a Western style parliament. This is incredibly new to them. This is a very big innovation, and they don't really know how to conduct themselves at times, and they're like figuring it out as they go. Would you agree with that?
No, exactly, because once the objective of the revolution has been achieved, it's now, well, what do we do now? They need to think of what's the roadmap of this, so to speak. What are we going to do now? We've actually got representation.
Yeah, and I think Amanat doesn't do this enough service because he's just incredibly pro-constitution and Mejlis. Incredibly, bro. I don't think he does us enough service. He kind of glazes the fact that like, oh, these Persians are so smart and intellectual that even without the Western tradition of like Magna Carta, like they did all this and achieved this much with their parliament, and all they did was like pass civil rights. Like, okay, like they did fix some state financing to a very limited extent, but these are the large accomplishments of the parliament, passing civil rights to minorities, and slightly cutting the state budget.
Oh no, certainly. Well, it's actually at this point that I want to come to the Anglo-Russian Entente, because this is something that's sort of looming in the background. Because obviously, later in 1907, we have the final end of the Great Game, where Britain and Russia sit down and they come to an understanding of their positions in Iran and in Central Asia as a whole. So as you can see, the boundary of Afghanistan is set. Afghanistan is a British protectorate, and the rest of Central Asia is been annexed into the Russian Empire. Iran is going to be a quote-unquote neutral country, which is not a protectorate, but Britain and Russia will have their own respective spheres of influence. So looking at this map, you can see that Russia has taken the entire northern half, where the British only get really Balochistan. And so on paper, this does look to be, shall we say, a very generous deal towards the Russians, but I think that's a very surface level analysis, because the main thing Britain wanted from this was they didn't want Russia turning Iran into a protectorate or getting access to the warm waters of the Persian Gulf or the Indian Ocean or threatening India directly. By doing this, Britain doesn't care if Russia has half of Iran. As long as the Russians are not in the Persian Gulf or threatening India, that's fine. The main objective of the Great Game has been accomplished for the British, and it's through this proxy war with the Russo-Japanese War and the Revolution 1905 that brings the Russians to the negotiating table. So now, in the wake of that, the reformists, the constitutionists, are concerned that their main backer, the British, have now come to this agreement and arrangement with the Russians and can no longer be relied upon as a partner. So there's a kind of a nervousness in the air, that because one of the terms of the 1907 Entente over Iran was that the two parties, the British and the Russians, recognize the Qajars as the legitimate sovereigns, but they do not recognize the Majlis as a sovereign entity and legal political organization in Iran. And that's what gives the constitutionalists understandable concerns.
Yeah, the way the British and the Russians approached the Qajars about this deal they had made is very interesting. It totally threw the constitutionalists for a loop. It's like, oh, you've divided the country already, and you're just telling us like into our face, and you've divided it in an incredibly arbitrary way that doesn't make sense at all on the map. And they're totally thrown aback by this.
Oh no, absolutely. And it's probably worth from here looking at some of the further constitutional developments that were downstream of the events of 1906. So, as I mentioned, Tabatabai and Behbahani, well, they became the leaders of the ulama in the Majlis, but they also represented the religious minorities, the Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. Once the second Majlis would be elected in 1909, what's also interesting is the Babi Azalis and the Baha'i were completely denied any form of representation. So you can understand why the Babi Azalis would end up siding with the more radical elements in the revolution, who would push for more radical change. It should also be noted that women were not given any representation or voting rights as a result of this. But it's interesting because you have to remember that it's around this time that you're starting to see women's suffrage in the world. Because if I recall correctly, I think Australia was actually the very first country to enact women's suffrage, which was when it became a dominion in 1901. If it's not that, it might be New Zealand, when New Zealand became a dominion in 1907, I believe. But it's around this time that you're starting to see it come in.
Yeah, that's much before World War One. I thought it was mostly post World War One.
No, Australia, New Zealand, and I think Finland actually were the first countries to enact women's suffrage.
Sad.
Oh, according to John, not real name, apparently Wyoming had women's suffrage.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that.
Oh, actually, I remember that because the OGC, Charlemagne, Red Hawk, and Mr. D were once doing a stream on the state quarters, and the one for Wyoming is all boasting about being the first state that allowed women's suffrage, and they concluded it was one of the gayer quarters.
No one lives in Wyoming, so that's irrelevant. But no, sorry, going back. Well, no offense to anyone who is in Wyoming. Wyoming's a great place. There are many fine people in Wyoming. But going back to the chapter, there is one more figure we could talk about. The counterweight to Nuri. His counterweight in the parliament was Hassan Takizadeh. Very important figure. Hassan Takizadeh was a liberal deputy, a radical deputy in the parliament. He was also Azeri, and this is a very important fact because there is going to be a lot of Azeri dissidents and intellectuals that will have a very large impact on the course of events over the constitutional revolution and what happens next. So, as a radical liberal from Tabriz was the center of was a majority Azeri city, and was the center of all these radical figures that we're going to learn about in the future. Very young, very charismatic guy, very intellectual as well. And he was the best orator in the entire parliament. And even the more moderate figures would defer to him because he was so good in his oratory skills in debating the parliament that he got his way in many times through these debates that people were not used to. These were very public debates, actually. It was a bastion of free speech, the Mejlis. And so when they heard Takizadeh and his very charismatic oratory skills, they were very, very easily convinced. And this is, again, very new innovation in Iranian politics.
Certainly, and it's probably worth looking at the role of Sharia or religious law as a result of the revolution, because one of the things that was passed was known as the fundamental and supplemental laws. They recognised Shiism as the official state religion, and it also designated obviously these three branches as we've mentioned, and it recognises the Shah as the head of the executive, who's the divine grace for some of the support of the people. But it's also noteworthy that, again, the support of the people, the Shah's authority does not come from God or Allah alone. It also comes from his subjects, which is obviously a somewhat democratic subversion of the tradition, because an Iranian Shah is their Allah, the shadow of God.
Yeah, this is the first time the people are the source of authority for the Shah, and this is a very, very big innovation in the politics of Iran. And
also another subversion of the Sharia was some key provisions, namely that the constitution granted equal rights to all citizens regardless of religious confession. It secured freedom of the press and publication, freedom of association, as long as that was not anti-Islamic. And also there's actually another little reading I want to do. It's from one of the articles, Article 2 of the supplementary law. One moment. I just want to read this verbatim. So, hang on. Okay. Yeah. Article 1 of the 1907 supplement to the fundamental law specifically declared 12 Shi'i Islam as the official religion of Iran, and Article 2 specified, at no time must any legal enactment of the Sacred National Consultative Assembly, or the Majlis, established by the Imam of the age and His Majesty, the Shah Hansar of Islam, and the whole people of the Iranian nation, be at variance with the sacred principles of Islam or the laws established by His Holiness, the best of mankind, i.e. the Prophet Muhammad. So again, there's all this sort of lip service to Islamic tradition, but there's also a subversion of it as well.
Yeah, I think the more moderates, particularly the two clerics we talked about, Tabatai and Behbahani, I think they were trying to fit the the square Sharia law and the round peg of a constitution, of a liberal constitution, and that's just irreconcilable. The liberals didn't even try. The smarter ones among them were very aware that this was an active subversion, and that was their intention. But the moderates were genuinely, and the actual like domestic intellectuals were genuinely trying to reconcile, how do we have this political reform within the bounds of Shia Islam? And this was a very big political problem that wasn't really resolved until probably the 79 revolution.
Certainly, and I've just got another little reading I want to do from the same bit on the other articles of the Constitution portrayed the same undercurrent of obsequiousness in fear of being labelled irreligious. Article 8 of the same document granted all the people of Iran equal rights before the law, a milestone for Iran's political culture. The equal rights were spelled out in the following articles in specific terms, including the safeguarding of lives, properties, homes, and honour from every kind of interference, and prohibited arbitrary or extrajudicial arrest, detainment, and punishment of all citizens, as well as infringement in their private dwellings and confiscation of their properties. Beyond basic rights to life and property, Article 18 declared freedom of the study of all sciences, arts, and crafts, unless forbidden by the law of Islam, and Article 19 demanded that the government establish public schools and supervise public education. More significant, Article 20 allowed all publications except heretical books and matters hurtful to the perspicuous religion of Islam and exempted them from any censorship. In the same spirit, Article 21 sanctioned freedom of all societies and associations, provided that they were not productive to mischief to religion and state and are not injurious to good order. The Majlis was also under great pressure to limit the sovereign's power. The division of powers, a cornerstone of any modern constitution, had to be manoeuvred against anti-constitutional Muhammad Ali Shah and his dubious ambitions. The Constitution's crucial Article 27, which assigned legislative, judicial, and executive powers to three branches of the government, granted nominal power to the Shah. The King's executive power, known as the Laws of Ordinance, were to be carried out by the ministers and state officials in the august name of His Imperial Majesty, in such manner as law defines. Moreover, Article 44 exempted the Shah from any political responsibility for the affairs of the state, instead holding the ministers of the state responsible to the legislative branch. Under enormous pressure from the court, however, the framers of the Constitution were obliged to assert in Article 35 that the sovereignty is a trust confided as a divine gift by the people to the person of the king. It is reported that Muhammad Ali Shah only agreed to sign the supplement to the fundamental law in October 1907 after inserting in his own hand the phrase "as a divine gift," rendering the article obsolete. So again, you're seeing this tension whereby the reformists are trying to essentially, cuck the Shah into being a symbolic figurehead where, the Shah's powerless, all his ministers have power, but at the same time, the Shah is not to blame for the actions of his ministers. But then you've got the Shah just coming in and going, well, I'm going to poo-poo your reform by adding this as a divine gift, completely throwing what you've said out the window.
Yeah, no, that was a good move on his part. He was Muhammad Ali Shah was much more combative than his father was towards the parliament, or towards, I guess, the liberal faction, because there was no parliament before his signature. I think the last thing we should talk about, I think we're getting towards the end of the chapter, but the last thing we should talk about is probably the assassination of a very important political figure, Amin al-Sultan. What do you say to that?
Well, if you would like to explain for us, because he's a character we've encountered before.
Yes, a new character has entered the scene. Actually, same character has entered the scene. So after Muhammad Ali takes power from his father, he appoints Amin al-Sultan, and he is a figure we've talked about in a different stream, and he is a pro-Russian minister. He is very much, I don't want to say in the pocket of the Russians, but he's a pro-Russian leaning prime minister, and he puts himself in the position of trying to mediate between the court and the parliament. The parliament is full of radicals, the court is full of conservatives, never the two shall twain, and Amin al-Sultan attempts in the process to mediate between these two things to come up with a working form of governance. And he fails at this task. Obviously, Amin al-Sultan is obviously biased towards Nuri and his faction. So the liberals essentially do not trust him and find him too favorable to the Russians, because the liberals are very much pro-Britain. Even if they're not getting the support they would like from the British, they're still pro-Britain. And tragically, actually, Amin al-Sultan is killed, assassinated, in front of the Mejlis, the building of the Mejlis, by a radical socialist who is also Azeri. Surprise, surprise. And yes, from a young socialist from Tabriz. He died. This is in August of 1907, and this is kind of, I would guess this is kind of the warning shot, the beginning. This is the preamble to the Spanish Civil War, but in Persia. You know, the Spanish Civil War kind of kicks off after the assassination of Sotero. I can't remember his name. Do you know who I'm referring to?
Yes, yes. It says yes, Sotelo was the monarchist leader. Yes, so his assassination was seen as the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. Yeah, so what indeed happened is something we'll get into more detail on the next streams. We'll look at what's known as the Royalist counter-revolution under Muhammad Ali Shah and the so-called Civil War of 1908 to 1909. I mean, it's hard to say if it's a full-blown civil war or rather just you know, the government troops getting in a load of skirmishes with a bunch of left-wing radicals in Tabriz and other opposition groups throughout the country. But it's interesting, obviously, we're talking about, you know, these, it seems to always be these Azeris or ethnic minorities that are being on the more radical side of politics. But there's an interesting implication. Obviously, we talked about earlier in the series about the Russo-Persian Wars and the loss of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and most of Georgia to the Russians. And it's interesting because around this time, obviously, you've got the early history of the Bolshevik movement. You've got people like, you know, Lenin, but obviously many of the Bolsheviks were Caucasians. You have Stalin, Ozan Nikidze, Beria, what were Georgian. You've also got Anatoly Mikoyan, who would later be the Soviet trade minister and even become, I think, the head of the state of the Soviet Union at one point under Khrushchev. He was Armenian, and it's interesting. You've got all of this radical sort of Caucasian element in the Bolshevik movement. And if you think about it, if those wars had gone differently and those provinces had stayed part of the of Iran, all of those figures would have been subjects of the Qajar monarchy. And I think the implications for this period would be very interesting had history played out differently, is all I'll say.
Oh, no, I 100% agree with that. I mean, Baku, for example, was the most socialist city in the revolution. It was one of the most socialist cities in the revolution. I mean, the Baku the Baku oil workers, because there was an enormous oil industry in Azerbaijan, still is to this day. They were very much a breeding ground for socialism. And, you know, all these Azeris around, you know, the border between Tabriz and Baku, where all these Azeris are located in Western Azerbaijan, which is what it's called in Iran. These people influenced each other. And when, you know, Azeris in the Caucasus, the Russian Caucasus, were influenced by socialism, they influenced their cousins across the border in Qajar, Persia. This is very apparent, actually, and I think that was a big factor in sparking all this radicalism in, you know, Western Azerbaijan that led to Amin al-Sultan's assassination.
Oh no, certainly. And speaking of sort of radical revolutionaries, there's a cell that's led by a fellow called Qajar Khan, and he's another Azeri emigre and bomb maker and electrical engineer, and he was influenced by Marxist politics and the Baku workers' labor movement, as well as the Russian Revolution of 1905. So it's funny that the Russian Empire, through its industrialization, is literally sort of weaponizing these ethnic radicals to then cause trouble over the border. And obviously around this time, one of the things that leads to this royalist counter-revolution is that Nicholas II had concerns that the situation in Iran was a mirror of his own 1905 revolution he had to deal with. And so ultimately he wants to rally around the Shah to help him assert his position, to keep out, you know, because what the Shah doesn't want is he doesn't want, you know, radical socialist revolutionaries launching a takeover in Iran and creating a hostile state on his southern border. which is obviously understandable. And,
No, he's not wrong. That was very much information. You know, these Iran had so many of these radical secret societies, and one of these other secret societies, well, not secret societies, but there was a lot of revolutionary socialist parties. These were called the Anjumans, the revolutionary parties that formed militias, actually inspired by radical, socialism and liberalism. They started forming militias, actually, and this is again a precursor to the breakout of the Civil War that would happen in 1908. Again, sparked by the assassination attempt.
No, certainly, and we should also note that these Anjuman societies were largely made up of nationalist socialists or, again, Barbi Azalis. And what's also interesting is around this time, with the creation of essentially freedom of the press, you start to see a massive increase in the amount of newspapers. And by 1908, there are 80 newspapers operating in Iran, and most of the press, you may be shocked to hear, supported the radical revolutionaries, funnily enough. And because they now got greater freedom of expression, they start attacking the Masrouet and conservative camp and the court directly. And in terms of other communications, obviously around this time, you're starting to see organizations of merchants. Yes, Telegram operators are even working with the radicals. So you've literally got these political radicals who are hijacking the transportation and communication systems within the country to support their own movement and propagandize.
The radicals have found the group chat.
Not
that Telegram. But yeah, no, the mass communication and newspapers, they were obviously very partisan, very, very partisan activities. Newspapers have always been partisan. What else is new? But actually, the funny story, and Ramana talks about this in the book, that the telegraph authority, like the state Qajar telegraph authority, the one that controlled all these communications, was run by a secret society of liberals, sending messages back and forth between all the revolutionaries, right under the nose of the government. Just incredible stuff.
Well, just goes to show you that you need to make sure your political friends, not enemies, are in control of critical infrastructure in the country.
Yes, it's quite important. It's quite important. But we'll talk about the Civil War in the next episode. Is there anything else you want to talk about? We can talk about what's happening today in modern Iran, actually.
Oh, well, no, what I want to do is you were talking about Armanat, who sort of, barely contained glee at the constitutional revolution as a great liberation of the Persian people. But something else he mentions, which I found so relevant to today, is that many came to see the Majlis as a quote-unquote sacred institution. The word is Muqaddas, which roughly translates
our democracy.
Yes, our democracy. In fact, I'm actually thinking of a certain modern health service in terms of something of a secular institution that's worshipped by its supporters.
I wonder what you could be referring to.
Mystery.
Mm-hmm. No,
the idea that this said institution could do great things in spite of its flaws. We just have to believe in it enough, and it will work.
This was very much apparent in a lot of the radicals. These are like, if we just do democracy hard enough, all our problems will be fixed. And I do want to give Amanat and the liberal constitutionalists some credit. These were actually very impressive people at the time. These were very impressive people. They were very intellectual. They were very well put together. They knew what they were doing. They were still being introduced to Western European ideas, but there were many impressive things about them, and you just don't see that today in our intellectuals or elites.
No, certainly. And one last thing I want to mention is just in relation to the finances, because one of the things, I think you've alluded to this, but the Majles try to rein in the state finances because they've gotten completely out of control. So by 1907, the state revenue was 7.7 million tumans, but expenditure was 10.7 million tumans, or a 37% deficit. The country owed $30 million in foreign loans, which it had to keep taking more loans and credit to pay off. The Majors tried to shave off about 400,000 tumans of expenditure, and they also abolished the Toryų land tenure system. However, most estates had formally become private by this time and were not Toryų, so they weren't able to really make that much of a difference to the budget. What was significant, though, economically, is that the income of the Qajar princes and the hereditary bureaucratic elite were reduced or completely cut altogether, and the Shah's own court budget was cut to a mere 75,000 tumans. And obviously, this was perceived by the Shah as an insult, but there's nothing he could do, as most of the public and were with the Mughals, and they were all powerful. So ultimately, we'll get into this next time when we talk about this sort of civil war and the attempted counter-revolution. But this is the last gasp of the Qajar monarchy to be relevant, and it would fail. And as we can see, it has, it's been cucked, it's been politically neutered, it's had all its wealth and finance cut off from it, and we'll get to him next time. But the final Qajar Shah, Ahmad Shah, it's so depressing because he's just a nobody. Frankly, he just sits there and just nods as the country burns to ash around him.
He's a total figurehead, as we'll get to. But this is the last gasp of the Qajar dynasty for all intents and purposes. You're 100% right, and it's a sad end. But we'll get to it. But things will get interesting. Things will definitely get interesting. I can tell you that.
I know, certainly. And so this is the last moment for anybody who's watching to ask a question or send a super chat. I'm just going to double check Entropy to see if anything else came in. Doesn't look like anything's come through on Entropy, and there's been no new super chats on YouTube.
I know there are people in the chat who are curious about our opinion on modern events. If you would like to discuss that.
Well, all I will say is I'm actually going to be on Iron Duke's channel later this evening at 9 p.m. British time on his Splendid Isolation sort of current event show, and I intend to bring up the current Iran protests in a lot more depth when we do that stream. I will quickly comment on it now, and all I'll say is you need to be on guard against what I'm going to call the Pahlavi slop regime of Maya Tusi and Goldi Gaman, or whatever she's called, and the crown prince Reza Pahlavi.
If you see a Western Iranian expat, they're retarded. Don't believe them.
Yes. All I encourage you is be wary with what information you see out there, and just bear in mind that you might be being lied to.
I think that's good. I think that's a good summary. I think I'll just say my piece on current events is yes, there are anti-government revolutions happening. Yes, they are somewhat legitimate. However, I take a more moderate stance in that there are radical elements obviously involved in these protests. Obviously, if you have listened to this chapter, there will be a lot of parallels between what's happening now and what happened in 1905, 1907. There are a lot of parallels. The difference is, in today's terms, is I do not believe these protests have the support of the clerics. I don't believe any moderate clerics support these protests. The merchants are a different story. I think the merchants are split 50-50, maybe, possibly. The students and the radicals obviously are on the radical side. The mullahs are not split. The merchants are split. And I don't think the radicals have the intellectual or social capital that they had in 1905, 1907 to make a change. I don't see this working out, but that's my take on the situation.
No, certainly, I think that's a very fair analysis.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a revolution, at least this year.
Just a comment from John, not real name. How much is the Iranian revolutionists described here in an attempt to get rid of foreign interlopers? If you're talking about the constitutional revolution, well, it's a mixed bag. The goal of it is more to you try and fix or reform the country into a system that better includes all segments of society and doesn't exclude them fundamentally. I mean, getting rid of foreign interlopers, I mean, you can make the argument that the influence of these Caucasian radicals, certainly you're not getting rid of foreign interlopers in anything, you're inviting them in to cause trouble.
I think it expanded it, especially to benefit the British. I think this revolution did expand British influence, did not decrease British influence. So that's definitely foreign.
Well, if you think about it, at least in the 19th century, the British and the Russians had to compete for influence. Now they've made a mutual agreement to just completely screw Iran over. And we'll get to it a little bit next time, but when we get to the Iran during World War I stream, it gets really bad. The Entente completely, do one over on Iran.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's going to be fun. not for the Persians, though.
No. Okay, well, thank you everybody for watching, and have a good day.